June 6th, 1944, 12:48 in the morning. Over the Cotentin Peninsula, Normandy, France. Inside a Douglas C-47 Skytrain, red lights flickered across tense faces. Engines roared at full power. The aircraft shook under anti-aircraft fire rising from below. Private First Class Harold Jensen gripped his static line. His boots vibrated against the metal floor. Around him stood men of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. They had rehearsed this drop for months, but nothing below looked like the maps. Fields were black. Floodwaters glimmered where dry land should be. Fires burned in scattered patches. And then the aircraft lurched violently to the left. A burst of German 20mm flak exploded just off the wing. The jumpmaster shouted, "Stand up!" The red light stayed on longer than expected. That delay meant only one thing. They were off course. And then came the second problem. The formation was breaking apart. Pilots across the sky were taking evasive action. The carefully planned drop corridors collapsed into chaos. At 12:52 in the morning, the green light flashed. Go! Jensen stepped into the darkness. But this was only the beginning of the problem. On the ground, German forces of the 91st Air Landing Division were already on alert. Major Friedrich von der Heydt, commanding elements near Sainte-Mère-Église, received fragmented signals. Paratroopers were landing, but not where expected. Jensen hit the ground hard, not in a field, in water. Cold flooded over his chest as he struggled to release his harness. The flooded marshlands had been deliberately created by German engineers. Water levels reached up to 6 feet in some areas. Men who landed here faced a simple reality. If they could not cut free in seconds, they would drown. Jensen managed to pull his knife. He cut one strap, then another. Around him, shouts echoed in the darkness. Some voices faded quickly. He crawled toward what felt like higher ground. But when he looked up, he saw no rally point, no signal light, no officers. He was alone. Across the peninsula, the same scene repeated. Instead, aircraft released paratroopers miles from their intended positions. Some sticks landed up to 20 miles off target. Units dissolved before they even touched the ground. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment landed with a fractured ankle. Despite the injury, he immediately began assembling whoever he could find. At 1:15 in the morning, he had only a handful of men, but that small group would soon become something much larger. Back in the sky, First Lieutenant James O'Donnell struggled to maintain altitude. O'Donnell, piloting a C-47 in Troop Carrier Command, faced intense pressure. Flak bursts surrounded his aircraft. His navigator shouted that they had missed the initial drop zone marker by several miles. O'Donnell made a decision. He held course for 5 more seconds, then gave the green light anyway. His reasoning was simple. If he waited longer, he might lose the entire aircraft. But this decision scattered his paratroopers even further. On the ground, small groups began to form, not by plan, by instinct. Sergeant Frank Cole of the 101st Airborne gathered 3 men near a hedgerow. None were from his unit. One carried a radio without a functioning battery. Another had lost his weapon during the drop. Their mission was to secure causeways from Utah Beach. But now they did not even know where they were. Cole made a choice. Move toward the sound of guns. It was not in the briefing, but it was the only direction that made sense. At 1:40 in the morning, reports reached German command that paratroopers were everywhere, but nowhere in strength. This created a dangerous illusion. German officers believed the landings were scattered raids, not a full-scale invasion, and that hesitation would prove critical. But the real danger had not yet appeared. As dawn approached, the paratroopers faced a brutal reality. They had no clear lines, no confirmed positions, no reliable communication, and very little time. Within hours, amphibious landings would begin on Utah Beach. If the inland roads and bridges were not secured, German reinforcements could move freely. The entire invasion depended on men in the wrong place. Somewhere in the darkness, Lieutenant Colonel Vandervoort looked at the growing number of men gathering around him. Different units, different missions. No formal structure. He made a decision that would shape the next few hours. He would ignore the original plan and create a new one. But what he did not yet know was that German forces were already moving toward the same objectives. And this time, they were not confused. They were organizing. 2:25 in the morning, near Sainte-Mère-Église, Normandy. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort stood leaning on a rifle he was using as a crutch. His ankle was badly fractured. Every movement sent sharp pain up his leg, but he refused evacuation. Around him were roughly 40 paratroopers. Not one complete platoon, not even one complete company. Men from the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, the 507th, the 101st Airborne Division, mixed together in the dark. No radios were working. Maps were soaked or lost. And yet, Vandervoort gave a clear order. Move towards Sainte-Mère-Église. That town was critical. It sat on the main road network leading inland from Utah Beach. If German forces held it, they could block the entire advance. But this was only the beginning of the problem. At 2:40 in the morning, German forces in Sainte-Mère-Église were already reacting. Elements of the 1058th Panzer Grenadier Regiment had moved into defensive positions. Machine gun teams were setting up near the church square. Patrols were being sent outward. Private John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment was descending directly over the town. As he drifted down, he could see fires burning below. German soldiers were already on alert. Then his parachute caught on the church steeple. He hung there, suspended above the square. Below him, German troops moved through the streets. Steele made a decision. He pretended to be dead. For nearly 2 hours, he remained motionless, watching the battle unfold beneath him. But what he witnessed would soon become something far larger. 3 miles to the west, Sergeant Frank Cole and his small group reached a narrow dirt road. At 2:55 in the morning, they heard engines, German vehicles. Cole signaled his men to take positions along a hedgerow. They had 1 Browning automatic rifle, 2 M1 Garands, and limited ammunition. The first German truck came into view. Cole waited 10 yards, 8 yards. Then he gave the signal. The ambush lasted less than 30 seconds. The truck was disabled. 2 German soldiers were killed. The rest fled into the darkness, but Cole did not celebrate because he understood the risk. Gunfire meant attention, and attention meant retaliation. Back near Sainte-Mère-Église, Van der Voort's force approached the outskirts of the town at 3:15 in the morning. They could hear fighting already. Small arms fire echoed through the streets. This was not a coordinated assault. It was fragments of units colliding in the dark. Van der Voort split his men into small teams, 4 men, 5 men, each with a simple objective. Push inward, clear resistance, hold whatever ground they could take. There was no reserve force, no backup. If they failed, there would be no second attempt. Inside the town, Private Steele still hung from the church. He watched as American paratroopers began entering from multiple directions. Small groups, disorganized, but aggressive. German defenders tried to establish firing lines, but the attacks came from too many angles. This was the unintended advantage of the scattered drop. Instead of one concentrated assault, the Germans faced chaos. Attacks from the north, from the west, from inside their own perimeter. At 3:30 in the morning, a group of paratroopers reached the town square. Grenades were thrown. Machine guns opened fire. Within minutes, German resistance began to collapse. But the real danger had not yet appeared. At 4:10 in the morning, German command finally understood the scale of the situation. This was not a raid. It was an invasion. Orders were issued for counterattacks. Armored elements were directed towards Sainte-Mère-Église. Infantry units were told to regroup and retake the town, and they were moving fast. On the western approaches, Sergeant Cole and his men saw headlights again. More German vehicles, this time more than one. Cole checked his ammunition, less than half remaining. He looked at his men. No reinforcements, no heavy weapons. Only one option: hold the road. Because if those vehicles reached Sainte-Mère-Église, they could reinforce the German counterattack. Cole whispered a simple question. "Oh, what would you have done?" Then he raised his rifle. At 4:45 in the morning, Van der Voort's men secured most of Sainte-Mère-Église. It was the first town liberated in Normandy. But holding it would be far harder than taking it. German forces were already forming a counterattack line to the south, and American paratroopers were still arriving, still scattered, still disorganized. Some units were just now realizing they had landed miles from their objectives. Others were moving blindly toward gunfire, and yet, somehow, they were converging. As dawn approached, the sky began to lighten. At 5:30 in the morning, naval bombardment could be heard from the coast. Utah beach landings were about to begin. Everything now depended on whether these scattered paratroopers could hold the roads. Hold the town. Hold long enough. Because if they failed, German forces would have a direct path to the beaches, and the invasion could be pushed back into the sea. Van der Voort looked south through the streets of Sainte-Mère-Église. He knew what was coming. German counterattack, armor, infantry, coordinated. And his force was still a patchwork of small units. No artillery support, limited ammunition, no clear defensive line, only determination, and a rapidly closing window of time. 6:10 in the morning. Sainte-Mère-Église, Normandy. The first light of dawn revealed the full reality. Smoke drifted through the narrow streets. Burned vehicles lay scattered near the town square, and American paratroopers, from at least 4 different regiments, were digging shallow defensive positions wherever they could. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Van der Voort stood near a stone wall scanning the southern road. His ankle had swollen badly. He could barely put weight on it, but he refused to leave. Because now the mission had changed. It was no longer about taking the town. It was about surviving what came next. At 6:25 in the morning, a forward scout reported movement. German infantry, advancing in small formations. Elements of the 105th 8th Panzer Grenadier Regiment were probing the town's defenses. Behind them, armored support was expected. Van der Voort gave a simple order: Hold fire until they are close. Ammunition was already running low. Every shot had to count. On the western road, Sergeant Frank Cole and his remaining men prepared for another engagement. They had repositioned during the night, dragging the disabled German truck partially across the road to create a crude barrier. At 6:35 in the morning, the next German convoy appeared. 2 trucks, 1 light armored vehicle. Cole's men exchanged quick glances. No one spoke. At 20 yards, they opened fire. The first truck veered off the road. The second halted abruptly. German soldiers dismounted, returning fire immediately. Bullets snapped through the hedgerows. One of Cole's men went down. Another shouted that he was out of ammunition. This was the moment the line could break. But the real danger had not yet appeared. Back in Sainte-Mère-Église, the first organized German counterattack began at 6:50 in the morning. Infantry moved in from the south, supported by machine guns and mortars. American positions were thin. Some were held by only 2 or 3 men. And yet they held. Private First Class Jensen, who had landed alone hours earlier, now found himself part of a defensive line with men he had never met before. Different units, different commanders, but one shared understanding. If they fell back, there would be no second chance. At 7:10 in the morning, German forces pushed closer, street by street, hedgerow by hedgerow. The fighting became close. Rifles, grenades, short bursts of automatic fire, no clear front line, just overlapping pockets of resistance. Van der Voort moved between positions, ignoring the pain in his leg. He gave direct orders, adjusted fields of fire, repositioned men. At one point, he stopped beside a young paratrooper who was shaking. The soldier asked, "Sir, are we supposed to be here?" Van der Voort answered without hesitation. "We are now." At 7:35 in the morning, a critical moment arrived. German forces concentrated along the southern approach. Their fire intensified. American positions began to falter. One section pulled back 20 yards. Another lost contact entirely. If the Germans broke through here, they could split the defense, and Sainte-Mère-Église would fall. On the western road, Sergeant Cole faced the same reality. His group was down to 3 men. Ammunition was nearly gone. The German armored vehicle began moving forward again, slowly pushing past the wreckage. Cole made a final decision. He signaled one of his men to flank left, the other to stay and cover. Then he moved forward alone, using the hedgerow as cover. At less than 10 yards, he raised his weapon and fired directly at the driver's position. The vehicle lurched, stopped. The German advance hesitated. That hesitation lasted only seconds. But it was enough, because something else was about to change the battle. At 8:10 in the morning, the distant sound of naval guns grew louder. Utah Beach landings were underway, and against expectations, they were succeeding. Landing forces of the United States 4th Infantry Division were pushing inland faster than planned. German resistance on the beach had been weaker than anticipated, but that success created a new urgency. They needed the roads. They needed Sainte-Mère-Église. They needed the paratroopers to still be holding. At 8:45 in the morning, the first elements of ground forces began linking up with airborne units on the outskirts of the town. It was not a full relief, not yet, but it was enough to stabilize the line. German attacks began to lose momentum. Their early confusion had cost them time, and time was the one thing the airborne forces needed most. By 9:30 in the morning, the situation had changed. Sainte-Mère-Église was still in American hands. The roads leading inland were contested, but not controlled by German forces, and scattered paratroopers had done the impossible. They had turned chaos into coordinated resistance. Later, when soldiers were asked what they said when they landed that night, the answers were simple. "I thought I was alone. I had no idea where I was. We just followed the sound of fighting." There were no perfect landings, no perfect plans, only decisions made in the dark. What made the difference was not precision. It was adaptability. Small groups forming without orders, officers creating new objectives on the ground, enlisted men making choices without waiting for command. That flexibility disrupted German response. It delayed counterattacks, and it protected the most vulnerable phase of the invasion. Strategically, the impact was enormous. By holding Sainte-Mère-Église, airborne forces prevented German reinforcements from reaching Utah Beach. This allowed landing forces to expand their position inland. It reduced casualties on the beach, and it had ensured that the invasion could continue. A failure here would have created a direct path for German armor to strike the landing zones. The outcome of D-Day itself could have been very different. The scattered drop, once seen as a disaster, became an advantage. Unpredictable, unstructured, impossible for the enemy to fully counter. So the next time you think about that night, consider this. Thousands of men jumped into darkness. Many landed in the wrong place. Most had no clear orders. And yet they fought exactly where they were needed, not because the plan worked, but because they adapted when it did not.